Where do you start? If I were to ask you in the Big Ten, biggest question, where are you going? Because to me, it doesn't even have to do with Ohio State. Ohio State is almost a given for me. Not an absolute, but a given. I'm looking at Michigan and Penn State. Michigan and Penn State are the Big Ten's version of kind of the Georgia-Texas A&M dynamic. Now, those programs are not apples to apples in comparison, but the dynamic's the same. Because you look at Penn State and Michigan, and you wonder, can they start fast? Because they're comparable. Neither one of them is the top dog, but they're both comparable. Can they start fast? Because if they don't, you could have some immediate negative ramifications on either end of this. I think more harshly on the Michigan side. They got Western Michigan in week 1, and then they got Washington coming in week 2. And on one hand, I'm a believer that Jim Harbaugh's made some right decisions, but if they lose again this year early on and then it starts compounding in effect, I don't know that that staff's going to have the ability to see things all the way through. Look at their schedule. If you're watching on YouTube right now, they got the Washington game in week 2, and we just skim over games like Northern Illinois. For that matter, we skimmed over Western Michigan in week 1. We'll skim over Rutgers. I mean, insiders in the Big Ten would tell you, don't do that. Don't skim over Rutgers. But then, even if you do your fair amount of skimming, you got Wisconsin on the road. You got to go back-to-back roadies, by the way. Wisconsin, then Nebraska, which for Nebraska will be no less than a Super Bowl moment for them. And then, of course, you got Indiana, Penn State, Ohio State. So you see quickly how it can compound. And with Penn State, I've beaten this to death, but I just think there's such a wide gap between what it feels like up there, whether they beat Wisconsin in week 1 versus whether they lose to them. And if they do lose to them, all those old memories, those bad, evil memories from last year start to creep in just in time for Auburn to come in there, because I am going to overlook Ball State, even though MAC insiders will tell you don't do that. But for the time being, we're going to do it. And Auburn comes in there in week 3. And it's a good old-fashioned week 3 must-win situation. So fast starts are imperative for both of those programs. Now let's talk about the Buckeyes. Has Ohio State's defense improved to the point it needs to that they can win a championship with? I don't have any doubt offensively about pretty much any facet of this team. So and that includes quarterback. It is strictly secondary, linebacker to a lesser degree, but secondary, and remembering last year the state they were in towards the end of the year. They do not face a lot of high-caliber passing attacks. So you don't see them exposed a whole lot. But you don't have to be exposed in order for weakness to be there. That's why I'm very interested when Ohio State eventually plays Indiana, which is kind of towards the middle portion of the season. I'm interested to see how that game plays out, whether Ohio State wins by 2 touchdowns or they lose outright or they blow Indiana out. I'm interested to see what the Indiana passing game is capable of doing. For that matter, I'm interested to see what Minnesota does to them in week 1. I think Minnesota's offensive approach probably a little bit different than Indiana's against Ohio State, but that's something to watch. Also, I wonder if you look across the entire landscape of the Big Ten, how does the tier system set up? Because you're looking at Ohio State's schedule right there. You got a hard time finding more than 1 loss, and I will even see that. I'm about to show you our record predictions. But let's just step aside from Ohio State. Let's look at the rest of this conference. I'm a believer the Big Ten is a very strong conference this year, and I'm a believer that if you want to call it the Tier 2, I'm a believer the Tier 2 of the Big Ten this year is deep, and I think there are teams here that can challenge Ohio State. Wisconsin is certainly one of them. Iowa's one of them. Indiana's one of them. Penn State's absolutely one of them. Michigan hopes to be one of them and theoretically could be. And the follow-up to that is, are they all Tier 2? Because there is a emergency disaster scenario in play here that, even our friends in Columbus, they know it exists. We will not talk about it, but they know it exists. And that's Ohio State just flat out loses a game in the first 2 weeks of the year. And then someone like Wisconsin is shining through the first 2 weeks of the year, and all of a sudden it just feels like there either isn't a Tier 1 in the Big Ten to start the year and everyone's in Tier 2, or maybe we have multiple Tier 1 teams. Also, not exactly Tier 1 or Tier 2, do we have teams that can come out of nowhere up here? I mean, do we have teams that could overshoot their projected win-loss mark by 2 or 3 wins? I'm thinking Rutgers, Illinois under Brett Bielema. I'm thinking Michigan State last year won games that appeared they had no business winning. Minnesota is a team we have ranked in our top 25. The AP doesn't have them receiving votes, period. So some things to keep in mind there. In fact, I'd be curious if you had to pick a team that was the biggest candidate to come out of nowhere. Would it be Nebraska? I didn't even mention Nebraska. Which team would come out of nowhere? Doesn't have to actually happen, but if there was one that was likely to happen, which one would you pick? Let's talk about some games of the year to circle in the Big Ten. The first one, you don't have to wait long for. We are 9 days away from it as you and I sit here talking tonight on this August 26th. And that is Penn State at Wisconsin. It's one of the games I'm most excited about in the entire first half of the season. It just so happens to be parked there in week one. These teams we have ranked 9th and 8th, respectively, in the JP poll. So we view this, for our purposes, as a top 10 matchup. If this game is competitive, you will not see our opinion change on either of these teams. In all likelihood, we still have both of them in the top 10. Perception would change. If Wisconsin won 27-20, perception would change. Reality for us probably would not. What about Michigan at Nebraska? We fast forward to the middle of the season. It's week 6. Michigan at Nebraska. We just talked about this. Remember who Michigan has played the week before. They've gone on the road to Wisconsin, and then they go back on the road to face Nebraska. Now, we need some context. As our buddy, who doesn't know he's a friend of ours, but he's one of our buddies, as our buddy Eric Bischoff says, context is king. And I got to know what Michigan has done the week before against Wisconsin in order to fully know how we feel about this, because they could be in wounded animal mode. They could be undefeated and looking to survive a treacherous road trip to Lincoln. You never know. But you also don't know what Nebraska's done. Because you look at Nebraska's schedule and you just assume they've got losses already by this point, but yet there's no guarantee of that. Nebraska plays this Saturday. They play in 48 hours, and they go to Illinois. It's a game I've given a passing thought to adding to the Ramen Noodle Express. I'm not. Therefore, I'm not even going to tell you what side I'd be on, because you'll be tempted. But Nebraska is still favored by 6.5. The line has dropped precipitously, but they are still favored. But what are the records here? This game has serious car wreck can't look away potential, or it has serious good for both of you. We never thought you'd be here, but now we're going to watch this game potential. So with that in mind, just a little Big Ten backdrop, let's take a look at the actual season predictions. There was a theme that I saw start to form as we started to put together the conference predictions, and that is not seeing undefeated teams as we run all this through the model, and the model spits out the projections, and it's carried over. We saw it in the SEC, where there was no predicted undefeated team. In the Big Ten, we do not have a predicted undefeated team. This is great. This is the fantasy of all of you who want more competitive balance. We got the Buckeyes still winning the Eastern Division, but we got them with a loss. Also have Penn State very competitive. They're at 10-2, and that's a battle. I mean, that's a very big battle. And so then we've got Michigan third in the East at 9-3. And I got to be honest with you, I'm going to ride with the model here, but if I'm spitballing records, I don't have Michigan at 9-3. I've got them closer to 7 wins than 9 wins, but I'm going to trust the model because we built it to kick our own opinion and gut to the curb. So we're going to go 9-3 with Michigan, and then we drop off a couple of games. Indiana at 7-5, Rutgers knocking on the door of bowl contention at 5-7, as is Maryland, as is Michigan State. No one worse than 5-7 in the East, which would be very notable if it were to happen. Over in the West, Wisconsin leads the way, as I expect them to do, at 10-2. But look at Minnesota, the number 2 team in the West. That, I think, would be a big surprise. They finish 8-4. That's a big surprise. They've obviously won a heads-up matchup over Iowa because the Hawkeyes have the same record, but they finished third at 8-4. And then the 4th-place team is a 500 team, and it's Nebraska. Fascinating nonetheless. Northwestern also 500 and the 5th spot, and then it's Purdue and Illinois rounding things out, barely missing out on bowl contention themselves. So Ohio State, Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game, and keep in mind now, if Ohio State already has a dent on that schedule, then they are not viewed as invincible. And then you got to ask yourself also, well, who beat them? Was it Oregon? Or was it week 1? I mean, did they lose to Penn State? Who beat them? So anyone on that schedule who has shown the ability to beat Ohio State certainly makes them vulnerable enough to where that Big Ten championship game is must-see TV.